Thank you, everybody who's here live and listening to my voice, and people that are attending the video live here. Oh, geez, do we have a special guest for you guys today? Astronaut Clayton, Clay Anderson, Nebraska's only astronaut, spent 167 days in space, 38 hours and 28 minutes in executing 6 spacewalks. He applied 15 times before NASA selected him as an astronaut in 1998. And he spent 30 hours working for NASA, 15 years as an engineer. I'm sorry, that was 30 years working for NASA, 15 years as an engineer, and 15 years as an astronaut, succeeding in one of the most difficult and coveted jobs in the world through perseverance and never give up mantra. His never give up mantra. Anderson employs NASA's plan, train, and fly philosophy to all his speaking engagements and projects. Coupled with lessons learned in the areas of leadership, persistence, and passion, he provides unique and out of this world insights for those seeking to achieve personal and practical execution. Clay's award-winning book, The Ordinary Spaceman, which I just finished, From Boyhood Dreams to Astronaut, children's books, A is for Astronaut, Blasting Through the Alphabet, and It's a Question of Space, An Ordinary Astronaut's Answers to Sometimes Extraordinary Questions, can be found at astroclay.com. Welcome to the webinar today, Clayton. I'm so pleased to have you here. We're honored.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is great. Are you in Houston right now as we speak, or are you in Nebraska?
I'm in League City, Texas, which is about 20 miles southeast of downtown Houston, between Galveston and Houston.
Excellent. So like I was saying in the pre-chat here, I just finished your memoir this morning. It was so good. I laughed out loud many times. The stories in there were so detailed and excellent. Yes. Great book. Awesome book. So, I'm going to start with this, even though it's out of order from the questions that I wrote down from your book. Just this past weekend, SpaceX launched Bob and Doug up into space. It was a big adrenaline moment for a lot of people. I think it reinvigorated a lot of people's interest in space. And all the while, I'm thinking, I can't believe I get to speak to an astronaut in a week from now. So if you could, maybe you could shed some light on what that feels like to sit in that position, waiting for launch, especially considering some of the history and some of the accidents that have happened, knowing that your life is potentially in danger. What does that feel like?
Well, for me personally, in 2007, when I was going for my first time on the Space Shuttle Atlantis, it was a very unique day for me. The whole day was new because I didn't know what to expect. So I watched carefully what the astronauts who had flown into space before, what they did. I watched what they ate. I watched how they behaved. I watched how they dressed. I watched everything because I needed clues. And when we headed to the launch pad on the silver Astro van, wearing our space suits, and we finally got to the pad, we went up the elevator to get into the space shuttle. It was a little nerve-wracking. I was pretty anxious, but we had an order that we were going to go into the shuttle. So the commander goes first, and then some other, and I was toward the end. And when I finally was seated on my back, in my chair, in my spacesuit, my parachute harness, and all that stuff, I'm trying to take it all in as I'm listening to everything that's being said. And the one thing that was constant was I had to pee. And all I could think about was trying to pee in my diaper, because for those of you who have laid on your back after consuming adult beverages with an adult diaper on and tried to pee, it's difficult to do. And when we've been trained our whole life to not do that anymore, when you're sitting there on the pad and you have to go, it becomes very, it's all you can think about. And so I tried to focus on doing that, but then I would hear words that were telling me we were marching down the timeline. And the closer you get to launch, the less you have to pee.
Yeah, that's crazy. Sadly enough, I saw an interview with Elon Musk, and he said some of his heroes that are astronauts didn't agree with, him taking over the space program and partnering with NASA. What are your feelings about SpaceX and what Elon Musk is doing right now for the program?
Well, I tell everyone, don't bet against Elon Musk. What he has done, what he has proven he can do, he brings a nice bridled aggression to the process.
Hmm.
He's doing things that no one else has ever done, where he lands the first stage of the rocket. He can land the second stage. He reuses the vehicles. That's all really important. And I understand the issues he had with the old guys who were very traditional about how it should be done. But my analogy is, imagine Orville and Wilbur Wright at Kitty Hawk in 1903 when their airplane flew 122 feet for the very first time. Now, what they did, they had no idea that you and I could get on an airplane and we could fly from Houston or Dallas or wherever to Abu Dhabi. And as we fly on that 787 or 777 or whatever the heck it is, we can sleep, we can watch TV and movies, we can be on the internet, we can drink adult beverages, we can take a shower in some of those planes, and we can go to sleep in a bed. No one thought of any of that back in 1903. So we're kind of at that precipice of space exploration with the ability for people to buy a ticket and go. It's going to take a while for us to get there, but we're a lot closer now than we were. So Elon is a forward thinker. He's aggressive, cautiously aggressive. He understands safety, but he also understands that pushing the envelope a little bit can be a good thing.
Yeah. Awesome. So it was 11 years, I believe. It was 11 years, if I have my math correct, since the last time humans had orbited, since Bob and Doug. Is that true?
You're close. It had been since 2011.
Oh, 9 years. Okay.
Since astronauts from America had been launched from American soil on an American rocket. So
okay,
that's the big deal, is we were launching from the United States with U.S. astronauts and U.S. hardware.
So I was shocked in your book when you talked about, when space wasn't top priority for the government and the budgets weren't there, and you were going to Russia to train, and they were sending you over coach, and you're sitting next to fat guys smoking cigarettes and getting drunk. And I thought it was really, really crazy that we are sending our astronauts. So 541 total astronauts of all time before Bob and Doug. And I mean, you are in rarefied air, and it's crazy to me that we didn't value what you guys were doing enough to send you in a more comfortable, vehicle to Russia to get your training. So why do you think it fell out of favor? And why do you think it's been 9 years since Americans sent humans into orbit?
I think it always has to do with money. When Bush was president, we had the shuttle, the station, and then he was creating, or his administration had created the Orion project, or not the Orion project. Oh, now I won't be able to, I have a mental block for a second, but okay. Constellation. So we were going to finish building the station with the shuttle, and then we were going to cancel the shuttle program, and we were going to go to Constellation, where all those people would go work for that program. And that program got behind schedule and under budget when President Obama came in. And then President Obama shifted, which happens all the time, shifted the focus to an asteroid retrieval mission toward Mars, where we'd go and we'd fly and grab an asteroid and bring it back near the moon. And then astronauts would climb around on that asteroid and bang it with hammers and bring rocks, and we'd learn science and stuff. Then you brought in Trump and his administration, and they changed it back where, and most people agree with this, even Buzz Aldrin changed his tune, right? He used to say, get your ass to Mars. Well, now he says, get your ass to the moon, and then we'll go to Mars. Because I believe you have to go to the lunar surface and learn how to live and work before you can send humans all the way to Mars to try to do it. Imagine the pioneers that came from Plymouth Rock, right? The Mayflower landed whenever it did, and those people made colonies and little communities, but most of them died at first. And so as they got stronger and smarter and lived and sustained life better, then they began to move west. And as they moved west, they came across Nebraska and Iowa, and they learned that, God, dog, this is tough. And some of them stayed in Nebraska and Iowa, and they learned how to live off the land. And that's kind of where we are. Let's go the short distance to the moon. Let's put a small colony down there to learn how to live and work. If you think about your gas that you put in your car today, you just go to the pump, you put your credit card in, and you pump your car full of gas, right? no one thinks about the infrastructure that's required to bring that gasoline from the ground as a fossil fuel and bring it up and refine it and so it ends up in your car. That's the kind of stuff we have to go to the moon to figure out. How are we going to do that on Mars? How are we going to live? Can we grow plants? What do we have to do? Can we get oxygen from the soil? Can we get water from the poles? All those things need to be learned, and we're not ready to do that yet. So I'm excited that we are going to go back to the moon first and figure out how to do it smartly and safely before we try to go to Mars.
Do you think it's possible that Mars will happen in our lifetime?
How old are you?
I'm in my 4th decade. Let's just say that.
Yeah, it's possible. I'm 61, and okay. I would sure like to see it in my lifetime, and I hope to live to be 81. The problem is it takes technology development, it takes money. And that money is way more difficult to come by in the United States of America these days. And it's going to take a consortium of nations around the world to do this. And when you start talking them that way, that makes it way harder.
Yeah.
Right. Because now you don't just have to convince an administration and a Congress. You have to convince them and all the other countries' administration and their Politburos and their bodies of legislation. It's going to be a tough road, I think. But I think people are united to want to do it, right? Everybody wants to go to Mars. It's just like everybody wants to go to Disney World. Most people don't want to go to Worlds of Fun in Kansas City. They want to go straight to Disney World.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So everybody loves an underdog story, which is what makes your story more fun than most. I personally, I tried 21 times to get into dental school, and I got 20 rejection letters, which I've saved. And on the 21st try, Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin let me in. For you, it was 15 years and 15 attempts to get into the astronaut training program. So tell us what it was about your resolve and your grit that allowed you to keep on going towards this one goal that you decided on, I guess, when you were 9 years old or something.
Yeah, I remember I was 9. My mom would tell you that I was 6, and that we would discuss me becoming an astronaut one day. But it's easy to apply to be an astronaut. It's hard to get selected. And way back in 1983, when I was first eligible to become an astronaut because I'd gotten my master's degree, I put in my application too early. I didn't have enough work experience, but I didn't care, right? I was putting it in. And in fairness to NASA and their program, they don't pick astronauts every year. Back then they did, but when Challenger happened, they took every 2 years. And then when Columbia happened, they took another big break. So those 15 years meant that I had to submit my application annually. Otherwise, I'd be kicked out of the pool. And so that was what my focus was. Every year to kick it in. I'd get a little card back that said, "Hey, we got your application. Thank you." And that's all I'd ever hear from anybody, right? Until year 13, when I finally got an interview. And when I got that interview, that was a pretty big deal because now I was in front of the selection committee telling my story and trying to prove to them why I should become an astronaut. But that didn't work in year 13. In year 14, they didn't select. But I put in my application in year 14. And then the following year, year 15, I got my second interview. And apparently I had done well enough in those 2 interviews that I was selected in that 15th year. So it's not hard to apply. It's tedious, but it's not hard. And then you just have to hope that somebody sees your work or likes you or decides that you're listening to. And that's the hardest part, right? I didn't have a PhD. I wasn't a military fighter pilot. I didn't fly military helicopters. I didn't invent anything. I didn't discover a chemical element. I was just a young engineer working at NASA Johnson Space Center trying to do the best job I could. And it wasn't until I got a little higher up in management where I got enough exposure to the right kind of people that helped me convince them that I was a worthy candidate.
Was there any time during that 15-year career as you're meeting and kind of brushing up against greatness and meeting some of the astronauts that you ever lost hope and thought, these guys are too good for me. I'm of a different class and maybe I should stop trying?
It was year 13. My wife, Susan, and I had flown to Seattle, Washington to see a good friend from high school, Jeff Rakes, who was a billionaire working for Bill Gates at Microsoft. And we had actually flown to Seattle so I could look for work because I figured I was done. They weren't going to ever pick me. And it like they even were giving me a sniff. We came back from that unsuccessful job hunting trip, and I walked into my office a week or so later, and I got a phone call, and they said, "Hey, this is the astronaut selection office, and we'd like you to come for an interview on such and such a day." And I hung up the phone, and I freaked out, and my flame that had been dropping and dimming and going away just went woof, and I was fired up again, right? Because now I had a shot. And that first interview told me they were interested. And after the interview was the whole thing, I didn't get picked again, but I did hear from people who had knowledge that, oh, they really liked you, Clay, but they didn't think your background and technical stuff was good enough. And so you need to work on your technical background and beef that up for your next application. So I did. And in year 15, I made sure I told them about that technical background. And that's when I got selected.
So tell me about, was it a postcard, a letter, a phone call? I'm sure you remember exactly where you were when you confirmed that, yes, I am an astronaut now after 15 years of trying this and 15 years with NASA. Tell me about that feeling. Where were you? And did you guys celebrate? Who were you with? What was that like?
I was with my wife, Susan. We were at the Canaveral Lock Station. So we had been at the Kennedy Space Center for the weekend because the launch was taking place.
Okay.
It was the last launch to send an American astronaut to the Russian Mir space station. And Susan had won an award. So she got a free ticket, free hotel to the launch, and she could take one guest. She took it. And so here we are. We're at a big party on 2 nights before launch, and people are coming up to me and Susan, and they're asking us really weird questions like, well, when you're going back to Houston, Clay, do you have any plans when you get back to Houston? And I'm thinking, why the heck are they asking me all this stuff? Well, these people already knew I was going to be selected, but we didn't figure that out. And then the next day, we were flying back to Houston, but we had a couple hours to kill. So we went to look for manatees at the Canaveral Lock Station near Cape Canaveral.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a pager back then. Nobody had cell phones. And my pager went off, and the number I didn't recognize, it was 321 something, 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 something. Well, I'm pretty naive, and I didn't realize that 321 is the area code for the Space Center in Cape Canaveral, right? 321. And my pager went off, and we had nowhere to find a phone. At this Canaveral Lock Station, there was just a little small building. And so we walked over to the building and we knocked on the door and nobody answered. We looked through the window and there was one of those black government rotary phones sitting on the desk. And so we thought, I need to return this call because I was the emergency operations center manager in Houston. And I thought it could be a disaster and I need to be involved.
Right.
So we opened the door slowly and we pushed it in. We said, hello, hello. And nobody answered. So we walked over to the desk and I looked at the phone and I pushed the little button and I didn't know what number to dial to go out. So I picked it up and I thought, well, I'll try 8 because that's usually what it was. So I dialed 8, I dialed the number and the phone rings and the person that answers it is a female voice. And she said, astronaut crew quarters. And I thought, astronaut crew quarters. I said, hi, my name's Clayton Anderson. And I got a page from this number. I don't think you want me. I think you want my wife, Susan, who works in whatever. And she said, stand by, Mr. Anderson. David Leesma will be with you momentarily. And David Leesma was the head of all the astronauts, which was good because if he called you, you were in. If anybody else called you, you were out.
Oh.
So I'm standing there and I'm thinking, what the heck is going on? I looked at Sue and I mouthed the words, I think I know what's going on. And Dave Leesman gets on the phone. He says, hey, Clay, it's Dave Leesman. How you doing? I said, I'm fine. He says, hey, do you still want to be a mission specialist, long duration astronaut? Yeah. Well, Sue started to cry, and I'm sitting there trying to be really astronaut-like, right? I don't want to be like a dummy. And he talks to me for just a few seconds. He says, I'll see you back in Houston, man. Congratulations. And we hung up the phone, and we ran outside the building to yell it and tell people, and there was no one there. Even any manatees around. And so we had to wait and drive all the way to the Orlando airport and check in and all that stuff. And we found a bank of payphones because back in those days, right, that's what you had, payphones. Mm-hmm. I called my mother. She wasn't home. I called my brother. He wasn't home. I called my sister. She wasn't available. First guy I got was my father-in-law, Sue's dad, Jack Harold. And I told him the news and he cried. And that was, and then when I got on the plane, we got on the Southwest Airlines flight to go home, a bunch of people started clapping. So that was pretty powerful. Our lives had changed. So.
Did they announce it over the PA on the airplane?
No, but there were enough big dogs on when flights or space launches happen, the planes are typically full of all the NASA people, and there were enough big dogs in there that must have been spreading the word when they saw me because a bunch of people started to clap. So pretty emotional day.
That is awesome. That was 1998.
Yes, it was June, this time of year, however many years ago, 22 years ago, is that right? Wow.
Awesome. I love that story. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit. This was one of the times in the book when I got choked up. There was a couple times, but this was one of the times, and I wanted to kind of go there gently. February 1st, 2003 was the Columbia accident, and you were already. What did you call yourselves? What did they call you back then? Were you still an astronaut in training?
Well, yeah, I was. I had not been flight assigned.
Okay.
I had made it through my basic training. I had a desk job in Houston, right? The astronauts who were flying.
Okay.
And then I got called by the commander from STS-107, Rick Husband, the Columbia crew, and he asked me to be one of their family escorts.
Okay.
And as a family escort, you take care of their families, right? You're there pre-launch, launch, during the mission, and landing. And you just do whatever it is you can to help them. I mean, I carried luggage. I babysat kids. I pushed kids in the swing at the park. I went down the slide with Elon Ramon's daughter about 100 times. I bought donuts for kids. I did whatever they asked me to do because that was my job, at least as I saw it. And so I was there with the families at the landing site waiting for them to come home on that day. And the way Kennedy is set up, the families have a private area with bleachers, just like at a baseball field. But a snow fence separates that area so people can't get in unless they're family. Mm-hmm. Next to that is another set of bleachers that has VIPs, senators, congressmen, Morton Thiokol people and that sort of thing. And we were just in our little area. It was the most beautiful day. The weather in KSC was perfect. Man, it was cool. The sun was shining. The kids were throwing Frisbees and running around and giggling and stuff. And we were waiting, watching the big clock because it ticks down for landing time, right? So people kind of get an idea of, hey, we're 15 minutes out, we're 12 minutes out, we're 10. And I was standing there talking to Laurel Clark's sister with another veteran astronaut, Steve Lindsay, who'd flown a couple times already. And as we talked, we're listening to the commentary and we're hearing some things like, hey, Columbia, Houston, UHF comm check. And I'm thinking, I've been trained enough to know that that's not right. Why are they talking about ultra high frequency comm checks? It's not something we do normally. And as I'm listening, I know Steve Lindsay's listening as well. And then I look over to the VIP section, and there are security guards, and they wear gray slacks, navy blue sport coat, and a white button-down shirt. And they carried back then those big black walkie-talkies with the tall antenna. Mm-hmm. And so as I glance over at this lady, I see her put her walkie-talkie to her ear, and a couple seconds later, her face just turns white. And right about that time, Steve Lindsay looks at me and he says, "Get ready." And then, my stomach kind of dropped because I knew something was up, because we hadn't heard the sonic boom when they come back, and the clock was ticking down, and we should have heard it minutes ago. And the commentary we're hearing from the control center is not what we should be hearing. And then right after Steve said, "Get ready," he looked around, and then I got the order. He said, "Get your families to the vehicle now." And that was when all hell started. It was a rough day after that, right? Because all these people are saying, "What's going on? What's going on? What's going on? Why are we leaving? Why are we leaving?" Well, I can't tell you. I don't know why we're leaving. None of us knew what had happened. And I was praying that they bailed out over the Gulf of Mexico, and they were all parachuting down into the water where somebody could rescue them. And we got into our vehicle. I had Willie McCool's wife, I had Dave Brown's brother, and I had JP Chavla's husband. And instinctively, I reached to the radio and turned it off, because it turns out that the airwaves and the radio waves, everybody was talking about Columbia had exploded over East Texas. And, then my job as a family escort became real, and I had to deal with them. And when you're sitting in a car driving 3 spouses of astronauts who haven't appeared at the runway like they were supposed to, they're all speculating in their brain, and they're all talking, they're stressed, and they're freaking out, and they're saying stuff. And it's like, please, y'all, don't talk. We don't know what's going on. Let's wait till we know something. And then they all got silent, and they were in their own grief, because they knew. I think everybody knew. And that was the longest day of my life.
Interestingly enough, in today's day and age, everybody has a cell phone. They would have known instantaneously, and it would have been a much different situation for the escorts.
Absolutely.
But you had a heavy heart knowing, and having to bring. It's just, I can't even wrap my head around what that must have felt like to have to do that. Were you actually in the room when they made the announcement to the families?
Yeah, when we took, so the way the plan, NASA has a plan for that sort of stuff. And at that time, it wasn't very good. It wasn't a very good one. So I had my families, Steve Lindsay had his families, and there was a third family, astronaut escort, who had his families. And we all drove back to the astronaut crew quarters building, which is a bunch of hotel-like rooms and some conference rooms where the astronauts hang out a few days before they launch and after they launch. Mm-hmm. Well, when you take all these families and you pin them in a room like that, in a conference room, it's not good, because they needed to be with their extended families, but the extended families were a mile away in another building. They were quarantined in another building. And so the young kids, they don't have any idea what the hell is going on. And that was probably the most difficult part. Rick Husband's daughter, Laura Husband, she was hugging her mom and saying things like, "Mommy, who's going to walk me down the aisle when I get married?" And her son, all he wanted to do was find his grandma and grandpa and go back to the hotel and swim. And then Laurel Clark's son, Ian, he was about my son Cole's age at the time. He was about 10. And he was in a hallway where the photos of all the astronaut crews adorned the hallway, right? And it led to the medical area. And he's standing there, and he's looking up at his mom's crew photo, and he's sorry.
Take your time. Sorry.
No, it's okay. And he's saying, Mom, why did you go? I told you not to go. I didn't want you to go, stuff like that. And so I knelt down next to Ian, and I tried to explain to him that sometimes in life things happen that we don't understand. And I said, like, when I was a kid, when I was your age, I never understood how Santa Claus could get through that darn chimney. You know, he's so big, and he flies down through that chimney, and he delivers gifts to everybody, and then he shoots right back out the chimney. And I don't know how he does that. And I tried to get his mind off of that. Mm-hmm. And you know, the worst part was when we still didn't know a lot of stuff. Everybody was speculating until Bob Cabana, who is now the center director at the Kennedy Space Center, he was the head of all the astronauts at that time. Mm-hmm. And I had walked down the hall to find him to see what was going on because nobody knew. And he said he was talking to another astronaut, Jerry Ross, who ran the facility there. And Cabana said, there is no hope. We have to tell them there is no hope. And then, yeah, it got worse from there, right? Because I go back down there, he walks down and he assumes his U.S. Marine Corps military posture, and he tells them there is no hope. And then the kids started to scream and sob, and the families were crying. And oh man, it was just ugly after that. And as a family escort, my job then became to gather all the things of the crew members who in their hotel rooms and gather up all their stuff because we had to get their stuff and the families to the airplane to get them back to Houston. But we couldn't do that because we were waiting for President Bush to call all the families on the phone. And of course, that took a couple hours. And, you know, so imagine all those people with all that grief and nothing to do and nowhere to go and nothing, waiting for the president to call and, you know, tell him how sorry he is. And it was the longest plane flight of my life. It was, you know, two and a half hours, but it seemed like the longest plane flight of my life to get him back home. So
that's so rough. Did you, I mean, as you're a father and a husband at this point, did you ever question whether or not you wanted to continue your mission with NASA and as an astronaut?
No, I actually wrote my school, Hastings College, asked me to comment a few days or a week later, and I wrote a little piece to them that said, no, I never questioned that, right? Because we would figure out what happened, we would make it right, and I owed it to them. I owed it to the Columbia crew to make sure we figured it out and to make sure we got it right. Otherwise, they died in vain. So, you know, there were however many astronauts there were that were remained at the time of the Columbia accident. Every one of us would have hopped on a shuttle immediately to go rescue them if we could have, you know, because the hole in the wing was something that if we knew about it, we could have tried something. You know, I don't think we would have been successful, but we could have tried something. And there were a lot of astronauts ready to go help try.
Oh, wow. So with you, when it finally came time for you to go up and you got the call, it's going to be your first mission. And I suppose for you were so inundated with all of the details of the launch, and you guys had rehearsed and trained. So you are completely engrossed in this process. But for your family, they remember what happened in 2003. So
yeah,
it was probably harder for them than it was for you, maybe. I'm just speculating here, but I'm guessing that it was really hard for Susan and the kids.
Yeah, there's a good documentary out there called Homemade Astronaut on the Nebraska Educational TV website. You can watch it for free. And if anybody's interested in seeing my kids when they were 10 and 6 and my wife and I when we were young, that documentary covers their experience pretty well. They were on the Launch Control Center building. That's the one, if people remember, it's at the launch site and it's got big glass windows that all the people are looking toward the launch pad. And that's where the launch is controlled from. And they take the astronaut families to the roof. And family escorts like me were up on the roof with the Columbia family. So there were other astronauts with my wife and 2 kids up on that roof. And I didn't know any of this, right? Because I'm at the pad and I'm getting ready to launch into space. But as we lifted off, I would learn later that my wife had her arms around the kids, together. And Sutton, our 6-year-old daughter, she looks up and she says, "Mommy, you don't have to cry." And Mom looks at Sutton and said, "It's not me crying, honey." And it was my son, Cole, who was 10. But I was fortunate that we were okay, right? We made it up and we made it back, and we did it twice. Mm-hmm. I will tell you that the second time, when it was going to be 15 days versus 5 months, mm-hmm. Kids were older. They were more comfortable. It wasn't nearly as scary for them as that first time. So you get better with age.
I guess so. Oh, I want to lighten the mood a little bit here, because there's so many funny parts of the book. Like literally, I was laughing out loud many times trying to. I listened to part of it and read part of it, but I was in the gym and just laughing out loud. It was hilarious. One of my favorite parts was your stories about how people came up with their call signs, and I always wondered that, like with Top Gun and fighter pilots and astronauts too, everybody has like these nicknames, and it always was really interesting to me. And you had 2 of them. One of them was George and one of them was Stitch. Tell us how you guys named one another. Who was in charge of that? How did they stick, and how did you end up with 2?
Actually, I have more than that.
Oh, do you?
Through my career, but
okay.
We were going to live underwater as part of our training. There's an underwater habitat in Key Largo, Florida, called the Aquarius. We were going to live as a crew, 3 astronauts and a NASA scientist with 2 hab techs. We were going to live underwater for about 2.5 weeks, and that was part of our space station training. Well, as we progressed up to the actual mission, you train a lot together and you get to know each other. And so the astronaut thing is call signs. Most of the military folk already have call signs when they get to NASA. But guys like me, we don't have one, but we want to be a part of the tradition. So we look for ways to generate call signs. And I was pretty buff back then. I lifted weights a lot. And so
you played football in college and track. So you were a collegiate athlete. So you're a big guy.
Yeah. And so I was pretty buff, and they called me George of the Jungle because I guess they thought I was stupid like George too. And so that one was my Nemo call sign until we were living underwater, and I had an accident on one of our tasks, and I sliced my thumb and with a knife, and I was bleeding underwater with a bunch of sharks around. And so Slice became my other call sign, or at least I wanted it to be, because I thought it was cooler than George. But as I would go through my training.
Oh, Slice, not Stitch. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
Right. Yeah.
I would see, you can't give yourself a call sign typically. So for me to want myself to be called Slice, that wasn't going to fly. Mm-hmm. Somebody else has to give you your call sign, and it's usually based on something you did that was stupid. And so later in my career, my second flight, my call sign would be Princess. And my call sign was Princess because I had trained on station for years and years and years. And now I was back training to fly on a shuttle. And what you have to do is you show up at the simulator and you get into the flight deck of the simulator and you sit on these aluminum hard chairs with little skinny thin pads. Mm-hmm. And you're sitting in there for 4 hours. And so at the end of this, my first simulation as a shuttle guy, after all those years in station, I got on the loop at the end. They said, "Do you have any comments, Clay?" And I said, "Yeah, my seat's kind of hard. Maybe next time could I get a different pad?" So we come back the next time. My chair has pillows stacked from the seat of the chair all the way to the ceiling of the simulator.
That's hilarious.
And I walk in and ha, 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 you guys are so funny. Well, after the sim was over, we go for the debrief, right? And at my chair for the debrief is a tiara and a scepter and a pink hat with the word Princess across, because Princess and the Pea, right?
Yeah, that's awesome.
And that one stuck big time. I mean, that one still follows me around.
I love that. So let's talk about space. I mean, you were up there for 5 months, 15 days the second time, but 5 months. I want to talk about the physiological effects of zero gravity, but let's talk about what was it like to be isolated 250 miles above Earth for all that time?
You know, most of the time, the isolation's not bad. It's fun. Everything, the big things we were going to do, the spacewalks, the moving a module with a robotic arm, visiting crews, visiting cargo vehicles, all that stuff was really nicely spaced out. So I arrived and we docked and I became a station crew member. That was a big deal. Then there was a little bit of a lull, but we were getting ready for our first spacewalk. So then the excitement builds. Then there was we're going to have visiting crews. So all that quarantine or isolation wasn't very bad because they keep you so busy. Mm-hmm. It's constant work. You don't really have time to think about stuff too much, especially early when you first get there. But there were some times during the long 5-month mission when it was a struggle. The tasks were repetitive. They were kind of boring. I kind of got into it with the ground because, and this is all in the book, mm-hmm. Got into it with the ground because they were jerking my family's chain a little bit, and I didn't think that was right. And then, and then we had a deal where NASA made Fyodor and Oleg, my 2 Russian crewmates, and me, we all had to do this same task in the same week 3 different times, and it was totally unnecessary. And of course, I let them have it when that happened, and that was not a good thing for me to let the Mission Control Center team have it.
So, as long as we're talking about it, how did you adjust to that kind of conflict and that tension between ground and you? And what did you learn about yourself in being able to navigate, for lack of a better term, that conflict and that rough relationship that you had with them for a bit?
Well, at first I went silent. I had read a book called Leaving Earth by Zimmerman. I think his first name's Robert. And it's about all the space stations in history. And when I read that book, there's a story about the Skylab mutiny crew where they got mad at the ground and they quit. They just quit communicating with them. I still had to communicate with the ground, but I was very short, right? If they asked me a question, it was yes. That's it. If the answer was no, that was it. I didn't talk to them. I didn't elaborate. I gave them the data they needed, and that was it. And they knew something was wrong because Clay was a talker. Clay liked to mm-hmm. when he was on the loop. So, but that was about the time the crew of STS-118 was going to come dock, and I was going to get to do 2 more spacewalks and do a bunch of stuff with them, fly the robotic arm. So they came at a really good time, and they got me out of my funk. But what my wife and I learned is we learned we could bond together, and the 2 of us could be strong and get through all this, that we didn't need this to bother us, that I knew I was doing a good job. I wasn't making mistakes in space. I was executing the timeline and the tasks and all that, and that we would be together again. And if it was my only flight, if I made people mad and I never fly again, hey, that's the way it was. So the 2 of us were able to bond and become stronger together. And she helped me deal with a lot of it because I wasn't getting much help from anybody else.
It strikes me as so interesting how strong personalities can be and how there can be conflict when you're not even on the planet. I mean, you're having conflict with people. That the human condition supersedes everything else. Even when you're in a spaceship 250 miles above the planet, there's still challenges with communication and interpersonal relationships and personalities. It's very, very interesting. I really wanted to ask you that question on how you navigated that and what you learned.
Well, for the people that are listening to this, think about it. If you, Mark, are in your home just like you are right now, right? You know your home better than anyone. But imagine that Allison, Addison, or Ashley, or somebody in your organization that's watching today is calling you on the phone and telling you to move stuff around in your house because that's what they think is the right thing to do. Well, you living in the house might say, hey, that's a great idea. I'm going to do it right now, right? That makes total sense to me. But if they tell you things that start to not make sense because it will make your life more difficult, that's when, the feedback loop has to happen. And that's where I wasn't very good. I told them, hey, that's not a very smart thing to do. I'm not going to do that because it makes no sense to me. Mm-hmm. And I live here. And so that interaction, maybe people can relate to that being in quarantine and tied up in their homes, that was the kind of thing, 250 miles up that I was going through. And I couldn't interact very well with my family and friends on Earth, right? You just can't be there to help. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you feel a little helpless. And so it takes a strong mind. And imagine now you're going to Mars with a crew of 5 or 6 or whatever it turns out to be. And you've traveled about 3 or 4 days from Earth, such that when you look out the window, you can't see Earth anymore because it's a little dot. Mm-hmm. And now you can't even just look at the Earth rolling below you and feel close to the people there. Now you're in the middle of nowhere for real. And that interpersonal relationships that are going to happen become even more important, more powerful, more dependent. It's going to be really interesting to me.
Was that part of the screening process or the training, is getting along with people in confined spaces and, the personality conflicts and those sorts of things? Did you feel prepared for that?
In selection, I'm sure they ask people about you. Hey, what's Clay like? Is he a good team player? Does he get along with others? But, it's really hard to tell until you're actually thrust into an environment like the underwater habitat, mm-hmm. Where you're living in close quarters with other people, and you may have conflict with them. But that was a short thing. 15 days is like what my mom told me. Hey, you can live with anybody for a semester in college, right? Short term is you can get through it, right? You can deal with it. You can, hey, let's agree to disagree and move on. But when it gets to be a longer period of time, little things fester. It's like having that pebble in the back of your shoe, and you're walking on a hike and it's just driving you crazy. And the more you ignore it, the more it bothers you. And so those are the type of things that are important to deal with. And fortunately for me, Fyodor and Oleg and I got along great. So I didn't have any issues there.
Awesome. Okay. So gosh, I could talk to you forever. There's so many things in the book that I didn't even get to cover, but 2 more big questions. We have about 10 more minutes left here, if you don't mind. The first one was, we recently had the privilege of interviewing Robert O'Neill, who was on SEAL Team 6. He's the trigger man that killed Osama bin Laden. And one of the things that we talked about in that interview was the letter that he wrote to his family in the event of his potential death before he went on that final bin Laden mission. Gosh, it was so touching. When I was reading your book, you talked about the letter that you wrote to your family in the event of your potential death before your mission. Can you tell us about what that process is like, and what have you done? Have you shared that letter with them since? Those sorts of things, I guess, are what I'm interested in hearing.
Well, the first time I wrote it in 2007, when I went with 117 for the first time to space, that was the hardest one to write, in that I hadn't written one before. I'd thought about this a little bit, but not a lot. And so, and it was really important to me that I put it down on paper, and I was actually writing it while we were in quarantine before launch. Now then I would get the opportunity to fly again in 2010. And it was different because my family had sacrificed everything for me to go that first time. But then for me to go a second time, when I was told I'd been assigned, I went immediately to my wife and asked her if it was okay. Mm-hmm. And then we talked to the kids and asked them if it was okay. They were 14 and 10. And they said, sure, Dad, that's great. I don't know that they really knew the ramifications. But when I wrote that letter, having written one before, I was looking at the old one, trying to pen a new one, and I kind of combined in that the kids were older, and my wife and I had been married longer. We had been through what we had been through before. So it was really important to me to try to get this one right, since the kids could understand what their dad might be telling them about how, much I loved them and what great kids they were, and how I saw just wonderful things in their future, and just hope they'd never have to read that letter.
Yeah.
And
Amazing.
the hardest part was our launch time was such that we were sleep shifted 12 hours. So when it was noon in Houston, it was midnight, or we were sleeping.
Mm-hmm.
And when it was midnight, we were awake when my wife was sleeping,
Mm-hmm.
kids were sleeping. And so the ability to talk was much more limited. And so here I am trying to stay awake at the Cape at 4 a.m. and writing this letter. And we were the only ones around. The crew were the only people around at that time. And it's really hard to do. It's very emotional.
Well, thank you for the sacrifices that you made. Pretty touching stuff. Okay.
You're very welcome.
Last question. And I want to end on a high note here, because this is something that I know that you speak a lot about, and that's leadership. So what leadership lessons that you picked up before or after your time with NASA could you share with our audience as far as instruction or advice?
Well, first of all, I'm not trained as a leader, right? I haven't gone to leadership classes and things like that. But as you said, I've picked up things along the way. And some of the things are trivial, or could be sensed to be trivial or simple. For example, as a boss man, if I were to become a boss again, I'd have a 15-minute rule where if you come in my office with a complaint, you get 5 minutes to tell me and bitch, and then you get 10 minutes to tell me how long or how you're going to solve the problem.
Oh, I like that.
That's an easy one, right? Clay's 15-minute rule. I don't know where I learned it. Maybe I learned it, came up with it myself, but 5 minutes to complain, 10 minutes to tell me how you're going to fix it, right? Because I don't want everybody dumping their problems on me and I have to solve it all the time.
Sure.
The other thing that's really important to me is even if you're not the commander, you're always a leader. If you're not the boss, or you're not the general, or you're not the CEO, you're still a leader. You can use that to be influential in your organization's activities. And that means you have to be vocal. You can't sit back. You have to speak your mind, and you have to speak it when it matters. And you have to speak it in the right way. And that's one of the lessons I didn't learn very well when I was in space. I hope I'm better at it now, but you have to use the right tone of voice. You can't be a condescending, arrogant idiot, even if you're right, even if your point is right, but you can always be a leader, even if you're not the commander. And then the last one I think is important to me is that you can't be a good leader unless you're a good follower. If you can't exhibit the characteristics of what a good follower is, you're going to have a really hard time leading anyone. And that's why I encourage people I talk to practice that followership in those opportunities. That, I teach kids at Iowa State University, and I teach freshman aerospace engineers, and we talk about this a lot, that when you're on a team, you can't always be the leader, but if you're a good follower, the success of the team can be built on the opportunities or the work performed by good followers. So, I mean, those are, I don't know how good of lessons they are, but they help me a little bit. So
I like the 15 a lot. I'm going to use that tomorrow.
Good.
God knows not enough people come into my office bitching. So that's awesome.
It's universal, man.
Yeah. No matter what field you're in. Right.
Exactly.
So Clay, I can't thank you enough. This was just an incredible treat. What an honor to speak to you. Thank you so much for everything you've done for Nebraska, for Texas, for the United States, for NASA and the world. You're a living American hero, and it's been my honor to speak to you today.
Oh, thank you, Mark. I appreciate all those kind words. And for everybody out there listening, that when I moved from Nebraska to Texas, I raised the IQ in both states.
One more thing, guys, go to Astro Clay, ASTRO Clay.com to pick up a copy of Ordinary Spaceman. It is awesome. It's a really, really good book. It's funny. It'll make you laugh. It'll make you cry. And it's something, the stories I'm already sharing with my kids, they're going to get to watch this interview too. So what a treat. It's incredible.
I also want to push Clay, your other book, A is for Astronaut. That's for kids. I've got a copy in my waiting room so kids can watch it or read it when they're waiting for their appointments. And I'll read it tonight to my kids. And then you got another book coming out this fall, right, Clay?
Letters from Space.
Ooh, cool.
Excellent.
So when will that be out?
It comes out in September. It's from the same publisher as A is for Astronaut. The illustrator's amazing. She's from Hungary, Budapest, Hungary. And her name is Susan Battery. So, if you get bored, Google Susan Battery and you can see some of her work. And I'm real excited about this one. It's going to be a great children's book. And you can put one of those in your lobby too.
Yeah, cool. For sure.
Definitely will.
Well, it's been a pleasure, Clayton. Thank you so much for everything you've done, and continue to kick ass. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks. Let's do it again sometime. And
okay, for sure.
Sounds good.
Floss and brush twice a day.
Beautiful grill you got there, buddy.
Thank you.
Take care. Adios.
Thanks, you guys. I appreciate you having me on.
Okay. Bye-bye now.